in the day-to-day of life, bad things happen, and it's easy to get pessimistic. But my worldview, I don't know if that worldview is the right word. My reading of the data is that over the last 250 years, with hiccups, living conditions in the planet for the overwhelming majority of the population have constantly improved.
Yeah.
Now, they are not perfect everywhere yet, but measure by measure by measure by measure, especially in the developed world and to a large extent also in the developing world. If you compare conditions for whatever variable today with 25 years ago, with 50 years ago, with 75 years ago, with 100 years ago, we are improving constantly. Now, you go through bad periods, you go through bad things that happen, things that are discouraging, and it is easy to become downcast. Yeah. But the long-term picture that we have, and there's no guarantee that it will continue forever, but the long-term picture for the last 250 years is one of improvement across many, many areas.
Right. Yeah.
Now, aside from that, I would mention that the politics in the last 5-10 years are complicated, and they don't necessarily fit that picture perfectly. But the thing to remember is that progress is not linear.
Right.
We have had messy problems before. Living through the 70s was not a happy time. Living through the 1930s was not a happy time. And you know, there are trials and tribulations. There are times when you know, the night is dark, but the morning still comes, to get a little poetic about it.
Yeah. I agree with that. So I was trying to make an analogy or comparison to some of the views that you were talking about with governments or having more than one person instead of having, you know, one person that runs everything. And I was looking like in a business, let's say like take the Fortune 500 companies, the top 500 companies in the country. It's amazing to see this culture that's so vastly different amongst each company. And sometimes when you were talking about, you end up with, earlier you were talking about these counties that border each other or states that border each other that can have vastly different rules, and it makes it difficult to have commerce, essentially, this interchange between the two of them. But I've seen that in companies, because some companies, like if you look at the culture of some of our companies, we're very much on like delayed gratification and very much on, we don't take sick time, we don't take days off, we don't do these things, and everybody works really, really, really hard, and you know, we're putting in 80 to 100 hours a week. Like there's this different culture from the top down, right? But then you also see some of the other companies where it's completely different, and maybe some of these are state ran, where, you know, I joke on my brother. My younger brother went swimming for lunch and got chlorine in his eyes. I was irritated, so he took the day off as part of a sick day, right? Like that would never happen in our business, right? In our businesses. So you end up with like these companies are almost like little governments themselves too. And it's kind of interesting to see. You have like the Google effect where, you know, they're trying to really take care of their customers and people love working there. Or Edward Jones is a financial institution that's one of the top 100 places to work. They provide a lot of benefits to their employees. So you start looking at like these different ways that these different companies are solving the same problem. And I think that kind of speaks to what you were saying earlier, like, the problem is there is no one way, and what works, say, in Greensboro, North Carolina may not work in Jacksonville, Florida, and it may not work in Los Angeles or Houston, Texas, et cetera. So I can see that. I actually didn't think about that depending on the culture of the area, that you may have to handle things differently because it may not be acceptable there.
I think with companies also, you know, a corporation is sort of like its own entity, its own thing, and it has a goal, is to make money.
Yeah.
So, you know, it's to make money or have a certain production goal or something like that. So maybe we could look at government the same way as, you know, what's the goal of the government? What's the goal of the country? And maybe if the government was more focused on one goal, that it would be more efficient. But you get into bureaucracy problems too, even with corporations.
I don't know if this will blow your mind, but
I'm ready to be my mind blown.
Let me tell you something that you might find liberating, discouraging, but ultimately I think it's analytically useful, and it's outrageous So don't take it seriously, but just use it as a construct to think and then learn from it.
Okay.
I would venture, you could posit that the United States government does not exist. And by that, I don't mean to say that you cannot go to a building and it says United States government. What I mean by that is that you're talking about what goals do we want.
Yeah.
And by that, you probably mean what goals do the people have.
Right.
And what I venture is that we don't have the ability to figure out what the voters want. The voters are not an entity with a single mind, like like in Star Trek, the Borg. You can sum what people think. We have very limited ways to figure out what people want.
Right.
Through social media, through the media, through writing letters to the editor, through elections. But I mean, just by what we discussed earlier about the problem of 75, 25, 49, 51, and that was by simplifying everybody's views on economics, social issues. We have elections, and I cannot think of you're thinking of how do we appoint the right experts. I cannot think of a better way to run the government than through periodic elections. But elections, you get two candidates with a very complex platform from one candidate and another candidate with a very different platform, very complex. And, as a voter, you choose between the two. But, how closely does that reflect the complexity of the views that society have? And I would even go further, that the two candidates feel obligated to have a detailed, especially if you're running for president, they put forth a very detailed platform covering all these issues, half of which they are not experts in, half of which they haven't thought about. So they hire experts to tell them, what do I say about this that sounds smart, that doesn't constrain me too much, that doesn't get me into trouble, that can get me elected? So do they really think it? Who thinks that? So in the end, we don't really know what the people think. The people themselves may not know what they themselves think because they may not have thought hard about the issues. And further, the people don't exist.
Yeah.
What you have is a collection of individuals that show up on election day and they go, which party do I like again? Or which one upset me more? Or which one? Or what did we have the most negative commercials about? So the people is a useful abstraction that gives legitimacy to our government, and it's a good thing that the government have legitimacy, because otherwise we would have civil war. But the people doesn't exist as in an entity that develops clear purposes.
Yeah.
The U.S. government does not exist as an unified entity with a mind that can carry out processes. What you have are people as voters, politicians, people running for office, people in different positions of the bureaucracy, all trying to do the best they can, or the worst, depending on how you feel about them, bumbling along. But there is no such thing as the United States government with a single mind carrying out any purpose. So even if we figured out what purpose we want, which is extremely difficult,
yes,
we couldn't get the U.S. government to do it because the U.S. government doesn't exist as a single entity. So I think thinking about things in this way is helpful.
Yeah.
In that it brings you down from let's figure out the purposes to looking at some nitty-gritty details of, well, here are a few things that are wrong and we could fix those things, or maybe we can educate voters, or maybe we can try to elect better politicians. But the big picture, let's start from scratch and redesign everything, is unlikely to yield good outcomes. We've done that before. It's called revolutions, and they typically end up with a lot of blood.
Yeah.